Hey guys, so in today's video we're going to be discussing Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. Now this is an extraordinary set of ideas that really allows us to see the map for navigating the contents of the unconscious mind. Stay tuned. Now, I'm going to show you guys this diagram here. This is a small diagram that represents the complete cycle of the hero's journey. Now, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is this boundary that's labeled known and unknown. And now this is a universal thing that we see within all great forms of myth and mythology. And what this actually describes is, in fact, the boundary between the conscious world and the world of dreams. Now, in old forms of mythology, people would tell their tales about the hero venturing into some unknown land. They would say, oh, the hero went far into the land of the north, or the hero went far into the land of the east, right? The hero would always go into some mysterious realm where no one had been, because in those environments, the imagination can run wild and free. The contents of one's dreaming consciousness can be projected into those areas where the environment is unknown. You know, I remember being a kid and going on trips to the mountains and staring off into the woods, right? Out where I grew up, there was a thick tree line, and I'd stare into those trees, you know, just really wondering, you know, what's out there? What's out there in those woods, right? And my imagination would fill it. And, you know, there was some yearning to go into that space, and I never understood why. In fact, a good friend of mine years later, he said, you know, I don't understand why you go off on these hiking trips. You know, you go for 4 days into the woods and there's nothing out there. It's just sticks and trees and rocks, you know. And I remember thinking, I'm going, you know what? He's right. It is just sticks and rocks. You know, there's nothing out there, right? So I had to ask myself, I'm going, you know, why is it? Why is it that I go out into these places? Why do I go so far into the wilderness? And I realized that it was a quest to discover the contents of the unconscious mind. It was a metaphor for the world of dreams. You can see someone staring into a very deep pool of water and they can have the same experience, or perhaps staring up into the sky, you know, staring out among the stars. You fill the emptiness between the stars with the contents of your imagination and dreams, right? So this serves as a canvas, a kind of backdrop against which we can project the contents of the unconscious mind. This is the foundation of all great myths and mythologies. But it also reminds us, and this is so important to understand, that all great stories, all great tales are not referring necessarily to physical realities, historical realities. Sometimes myths, stories, and great quests are describing contents of our own mind, the world of dreams. So the great hero's journey always begins with an average individual, somebody who's just leading life as they'd always led it before, going to work every day, doing their chores, everything is boring and humdrum, right? But generally, the hero will feel this calling to adventure. It'll be a really unruly, rebellious teenager, or, you know, an adult who doesn't seem to want to show up to work on time, right? This is somebody who just can't seem to fit with the status quo because they're not satisfied with life. They're not satisfied with this programmatic life of just moving through a bunch of hoops and raising a family. They want something more, some great adventure to be lived.
You have a problem with authority, Mr. Anderson. You believe that you are special, that somehow the rules do not apply to you. Obviously, you are mistaken.
Generally, the hero will then be introduced to some kind of supernatural aid. This is Obi-Wan Kenobi, this is Gandalf, this is Morpheus, right? This will be some kind of figure who will come into the hero's life and introduce him to this world, this other dimension of reality, this other dimension to life that the hero has never otherwise been introduced to. This overseer or this instructor will supply the ego with some kind of tool, some kind of weapon.
What is it? Your father's lightsaber. This is the weapon of a Jedi Knight. Not as clumsy or random as a blaster. elegant weapon for a more civilized age.
Religion occupies this role as well. It occupies the role of the sage, right? So people come to religion and they think it's all about morality, do's and don'ts, but really the morals, the beliefs, the symbols, the sacraments, these are all tools that the religious organization is equipping the ego with so that it can go out there into the world and face these powers of darkness and survive, because it now knows, it has now recognized the path to illumination, the path to the transcendent, the path to the self-archetype.
The Force?
And the Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, it penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together.
Now I've decided to represent some of this in a particular set of diagrams, and here you guys can see there's this picture of water and land. And I want to draw your attention to that surface of the water. This is again a representation for the boundary between waking awareness and the contents of the unconscious mind. I'm also going to overlay over this the symbol of a house. Now, the reason I've done this is because quite often in dreams you will see the psyche represented as a home, where consciousness lives on the upper floors and the various levels of the unconscious mind go down in succession into the basement of the home. And so these are all metaphors to describe the contents of our unconscious. Now the ego really has set itself up as the king. It's the ruler, at least in its own estimation, of the psyche and of the world around it. And the ego always stands as the representative of some kind of system, government, society, or civilization. And this is really the civilization that we occupy. It is essentially egocentric. You look at government officials. These are incarnations of pure ego consciousness.
But I'm leading in every poll by a lot. It looks like I'm going to win. My whole life has been about winning.
Discerning, discriminating, dividing, defining states of consciousness. This discerning, discriminating quality of ego consciousness is always represented by, in some way or another, by some kind of weapon, and generally the sword is the most popular. And the reason for this is because what does a sword do? A sword divides. Right? This is the essential quality of the ego. The ego splits and divides, saying this is good and this is evil. Now, essentially, the religious path is an attempt to transcend this egocentric thinking, but this egocentric thinking of dividing good from evil, right from wrong, and the ability to discriminate is an essential tool of ego consciousness, and it's necessary for the psyche. A mature ego can always be recognized by the ability to make a definitive choice. Decision-making power is really the essence of what it means to possess a sword. A sword divides and says, I'm going this way and not that. I'm going to take this path and not that path. This is the discriminating power of ego consciousness, and we see it represented in the myths by a sword. And sometimes, like in the myths of King Arthur, the unconscious will present this power of discrimination to the ego, and the ego receives this magical ability of wisdom to discriminate and decide. And this is the essential quality that the ego must possess before it begins the hero's journey. This is really what's meant when we say you must have an ego before you can overcome it. You know, if egoism, if the dissolving of the ego was the whole goal of the hero's journey, then you would be finished the journey as a little infant child, right? Children have no ego. So it's not so much about just erasing the ego, so much as it's about bringing the ego into cooperation with the other powers of the subconscious mind. So the teacher, the guru, Obi-Wan Kenobi, he'll present the ego with this discriminating power. And by the way, guys, in some sense, that's what I'm doing right now. I'm in the role of the old wise man who is now teaching the disciple, teaching the pupil, teaching the student on how to navigate the contents of the unconscious mind. So if you're saying to yourselves, I really wish I could find some sort of Obi-Wan Kenobi for my life, well, congratulations, you've just found it, right? That's the role that I'm in right now in making this video. So the ego will then be faced with the threshold crossing, and this will be represented in a number of different ways in various different myths. Sometimes it'll be represented by crossing the surface of the lake. Sometimes it'll be represented by crossing a river.
Be confident! Be confident!
Have you ever had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?
This can't be.
Be what? Be real?
You can see the threshold crossing represented here in the major arcana by the high priestess. She stands between Boaz and Joachim. These were the pillars that stood on the outside of Solomon's temple. And the high priestess has above her the fruits of the pomegranate, which was the fruit of the underworld. So this represents the fact that the ego is crossing into the world of dreams, and here below the high priestess's foot is the crescent moon, another symbol of the dreaming life. Right? As soon as the ego steps across that threshold, there's no going back. This is a point of no return. And the ego is then confronted with the powers of the shadow archetype. So the first thing the ego comes up against is the contents of his own repressed and suppressed mind.
Atreyu has to face his true self.
So what? That won't be too hard for him.
Oh, that's what everyone thinks. But kind people find that they are cruel. Brave men discover that they are really cowards. Confronted with their true selves, most men run away screaming.
What's in there?
Only what you take with you.
And this, in fact, describes most people's experiences of dreaming. When you start to approach the contents of dreams, the first thing you're confronted with are all of those repressed memories that you've tried to escape. I recently did this with my wife. You know, she's recently pregnant, and so pregnant women tend to dream a lot, and so we've been working with her dreams. And her very first dream called up a memory of bombers that she had seen when she was in Sudan. These planes would come over, and she said she was only maybe 2-3 years old, so young that she could barely remember it. But the planes would come in and they would start dropping bombs, and she heard the planes, but she was so little she couldn't speak yet. And so she went running to her mother going, woo, 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 to make the sounds of the planes. And that was how her mother knew that the war planes were coming. And so she grabbed her and they went off and they hid in the bunkers that were around the village. And that was how they saved their life. But this memory she had long since suppressed and forgotten. And it came up for her in a dream. She approached a river. And when she stepped into a river, stepped into the river, and again, this is a metaphor for stepping into the contents of the unconscious mind, she was confronted with this massive propeller that was moving through the air and cutting off people's heads as it flew through the dream. And it took a while. We had to talk about the dream, but then all of a sudden, bing, this memory came up and she goes, oh my God, she says, I forgot all about this. You see? That's the shadow archetype. And you've got to bring those contents up. You've got to bring it into consciousness so as to integrate it into ego consciousness. So this upper layer of the unconscious, the personal unconscious, is represented by a personality, the shadow archetype. Now, the shadow archetype will always appear in dreams as an individual associated with the color black. He'll be a black individual with a black hair or a black suit or even black skin, right? This is somebody who comes to represent all of the repressed and suppressed contents of the unconscious mind. But the shadow also represents all of those suppressed instincts. So there's this fascinating dynamic that exists between ego and shadow, where really the shadow and the ego are in many respects the two sides of the same coin. You know, I introduce people to the concept of the shadow archetype, and they're always inclined to thinking that it's something that they must overcome, they must defeat. But ultimately, the power of the shadow draws from the power of the ego. So if the ego seeks to overcome the shadow, the ego must inherently overcome itself. This is always best represented in those dreams you'll have where you go to strike somebody. You'll put up your fist and you'll go to hit that person, and then, your arm will slowly move. It's like you can't hit them. Or you'll try to injure somebody, and it's like as soon as you go to injure them, you lose all power, or your hand is stopped, or the weapon goes right through them. It could come in a number of different ways. But essentially, you cannot defeat the shadow archetype with violence, because the power of the shadow archetype is hatred and fear and malice and all of these negative, disturbing emotions. So as soon as the ego tries to use those emotional powers to conquer the shadow, the ego immediately becomes powerless, because it cannot defeat hate with hate. It cannot defeat anger with anger. It cannot defeat fear with fear. You must defeat anger with compassion. You must defeat fear with courage. You have to face the shadow with the contents of your own egoic consciousness. Now, this represents a real crisis for the ego, because what that means is that the only way to overpower the shadow is to surrender to it. And this is where the role of faith comes in. The ego must have faith in some greater power other than itself. In mythology, this shadow archetype often comes through in the form of the trickster. And the trickster appears in all Aboriginal mythologies. I mean, you can find tricksters in Australia, Africa, the Americas. They exist all around the world. It's a universal mythological theme. And the trickster always represents somebody who is chaotic, emotional, intuitive. He has no intellect. That's to say, he has no ego. Right? In European history, these are those devils that have the bodies of animals, right? This is the devil that represents all of the unruly instincts of the unconscious mind, which the ego must suppress. But there's another side to this. There's another dynamic power at work here. And that's the ego as devil. And you'll see this represented as well. There are really two ways you can represent Satan, right? You can represent Satan as the half man, half goat, bestial, unruly, undisciplined desires of the unconscious mind. That's to represent him as the shadow. Or you could represent Satan in a suit, in a tux and a tie, high and lofty, powerful, sophisticated. Yes, right? This comes through in the Matrix movies as the Merovingian, right? He says speaking French is like wiping your ass with silk, right? This is the sophisticated one, right? These are the two dynamics of ego and shadow. And the bigger ego becomes, the bigger the shadow becomes. And so it becomes like a teeter-totter, where the psyche constantly has to compensate for the arrogance of the ego consciousness. This dynamic of ego versus shadow is something that we really like to play with in a lot of films and movies, and it comes through in the villain. You'll oftentimes see a great evil villain, the ego, that is accompanied by some fool as his assistant.
The pinky and the brain, yes, pinky and the brain. One is a genius, the other's insane. In laboratory mice, their genes have been sliced. They're pinky and the brain.
So brain is the brain, right? He's the intellect, he's the ego, and he's trying to take over the world. This is ego consciousness. And his dynamic counterpart is Pinky, the fool, the trickster, who often serves as his conscience and the source of intuitive insight. So the ego will cross the threshold. He'll come over that point of no return. He'll confront the shadow, which is in fact the other side of himself, and then begins a process of trials and tribulations. And generally within our stories, within our myths, this is everyone's favorite part of the book. Right? This is where the hero fights and learns and, cha-cha-cha, right? This is where he fights all the powers of the unconscious. He fights all the demons of those demon-haunted worlds, and he has to confront them and overcome them and learn the courage to face these terrifying and frightening truths. And as he overcomes more and more of these evil powers of the psyche, he slowly draws near to the great crisis, the great moment where in which the hero is going to be confronted with the ultimate duel, where he faces off and squares directly off against the incarnation of his own shadow archetype. This battle between the ego and the shadow will sometimes involve massive powers. The world will shake, the mountains will fall, the sky will burn, right? It's this great climactic battle between ego and shadow as they square off to annihilate and destroy one another. This is the apocalyptic vision, which refers to the psyche. It's the whole psyche now that's involved in this great dynamic battle where the powers of good and evil have squared off with one another and they're fighting and slashing and cutting and tearing. And you can experience this in your life. I mean, when I was a pickup artist and I was studying Eastern philosophy, there was this terrible internal conflict where at one moment I'd be moved and compelled by really virtuous feelings, and then in the very next moment I was compelled to act in horrible ways, and I was constantly torn, between these powers of the psyche with which I was wrestling, trying to bring out of it something meaningful. I would go into my dreams and I would see my anima fighting these demons of narcissism. She'd come down into the basement, face these demons, and then be ripped to shreds. Her whole body'd be thrown on the floor. Right? This is the internal battle that's taking place where the ego is trying to find something it can hold on to, and the dark side, the shadow archetype, saying, don't look for the light, give up, give in to the darkness, come to the dark side, right? This is the allure of wickedness saying, come to the dark side. That's where all the power is. And once you have the power, you can conquer the world. So the ego eventually recognizes that, in fact, the shadow is in dominance, that the shadow has basically consumed the world. Everything has been shrouded in darkness, and there's just no hope for goodness anymore, right? This is the moment where in which the hero says there's no hope. There's no chance of us ever winning. And the hero, confronted with the alternative of going over to the dark side or confronting death, will choose death.
You are beaten. It is useless to resist. Don't let yourself be destroyed as Obi-Wan did. There is no escape. Don't make me destroy you. Luke, you can destroy the Emperor. He has foreseen this. It is your destiny. Join me, and together we can rule the galaxy as father and son. Come with me. It is the only way. I am a servant of the secret fire. wielder of the flame of Arnor. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun! Go back to the shadow. You shall not pass! Fools.
In the tarot cards, we see this represented in the case of the Hanged Man. So the Hanged Man represents Christ crucified, right? And what happens to Christ crucified? Death, right? That's the next card of the tarot. And what is the virtue that the ego must possess in order to survive this? Temperance. Because he has to face off with the dark powers of the world and overcome. And there he confronts the devil, the powers of evil that have basically taken over the world. And the ultimate end, the ultimate result, is the destruction of everything. He loses it all. Everything is dissolved. There's no hope. The world comes to an end. And this is the beginning of the great climax of the story, wherein which the ego, the hero, will die and rise again. So this comes through in many different myths in many different ways, but essentially the ego will always be brought into a position of hopelessness. There's no hope left in the world. Everything has been consumed by darkness. The world is dissolving. The sky's rolled up like a scroll, and the earth is melted with fire, right? There's no hope for salvation. And the ego says, you know what? If there's no hope of salvation, if there's no hope of goodness in the world, then I don't want to live. And the ego, identifying entirely with the goodness, with the abstract notion of goodness in the world, regardless of what the ego sees external to itself, resigns itself to death. And this is where the intervention of the self archetype, God, the mystery, the transcendent mystery source, will swoop in and capture the ego.
You see, I'm not a queen or a monster. I'm the goddess of death. What were you the god of again?
It's too late. She's already taken Asgard.
Asgard is not a place. Never was. This could be Asgard.
Tell me, brother, what were you the god of again?
Level, there are 4 distinct forms of boon that the hero can receive. These are the sort of gifts or the goal of the hero's journey. In the most superficial sense, the hero will acquire some object. This is probably the shallowest form of the hero's journey. This refers to Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and then relay racing, running back in order to bring this gift, this boon to humanity. Alternatively, the hero can be married. He can recognize what's called the anima archetype, and then there comes a goddess marriage. And usually in great myths, the woman in this case will be be an ethereal woman, an elf, or a fairy queen, or something of this kind, right? The less physical the woman is, the better, because it will serve to represent the fact that she is a psychic reality, or reality of the unconscious mind.
Who is she?
Frodo.
She's an elf.
So the anima is this goddess image that exists within the male psyche. And by the way, for women watching this, if you want to understand the difference between the male hero journey and the female hero journey, all you've got to do is flip the genders of these powers. Instead of the anima, you have the animus. But this image of the ideal woman or the ideal man, again, depending on if we're dealing with a woman or a man, will come up usually clothed in white. And this white clothing will express the fact that she is working in cooperation with the self-archetype, right? And so this goddess will appear in a kind of rescuing capacity. Right when the hero's being brought to the point of death, she'll swoop in and rescue him. And this is the marriage with the fairy goddess. On the next level, we have atonement with the Father. Now, this boon, this achievement within the psyche, refers to the ego coming into direct confrontation with the self-archetype, usually represented by a father figure, a kind of god type, who will come up and the ego will demand of the self-archetype, you know, why have you allowed evil in the world? Or why has this happened, right? There will be some great demanding for wisdom on the ego's part. And the self-archetype will reveal to the ego that this was the purpose, this was the plan all along, that the ego must recognize that the dynamic mystery of life is bigger than just what you want and don't want. This is where the ego has to put aside the sword of discrimination and learn to see the world as a totality where both good and evil, right and wrong, life and death, left and right, up and down, tomorrow and yesterday, hot and cold, all these dynamic dualities must be seen as occupying a whole, a totality, a wholeness over which the self-archetype rules. And it's not the ego's business to come into the depths of the unconscious and tell the self-archetype, well, everything up there should be this way and not that. The self-archetype will humble the ego and remind the ego that ultimately the mystery of life transcends human desires, fears, and longings.
Hello, Neo.
Who are you?
I am the architect. I created the Matrix. I've been waiting for you.
Others? How many? Others? Answer me.
The Matrix is older than you know. I prefer counting from the emergence of one integral anomaly to the emergence of the next, in which case this is the 6th version.
5 ones before me. There are only 2 possible explanations. There were 5 ones before me. Either no one told me, or no one knows.
Or the ego comes to the very highest form of revelations. And this is what Joseph Campbell referred to as apotheosis. And usually you will only see this in great forms of mythology, great religions. And what this refers to is when the ego is entirely dissolved. There is no ego anymore. And the ego realizes that it was in fact the self-archetype all along, that it was the transcendent that was looking out on the world, and it carries the truth of God in his own heart. And so the hero will then be raised from the dead. He'll come out of the spirit world. He'll sit up, and the shadow will be standing there and going, you know, you can't be alive. I just killed you, right? And the ego stands up, and the ego sees everything. The ego has become the self. The ego has realized the Atman, that transcendent truth of the heart that now dwells within his body. And he now crushes the shadow archetype, and the shadow archetype can do nothing, right? It's entirely powerless, because now the ego recognizes that the real power of the psyche is God, the self archetype.
Get up.
He is the one.
At this point, the ego will then begin the process of return. He'll take the boon and begin his journey back to the world of waking awareness. And this will usually be described as a relay race. You know, there will be all these powers of the unconscious, these demons chasing after the ego. Come back here with the boon, right? Come back here with the prize. And they'll chase the ego down, and the ego will slip through the boundary, over the threshold, and bring the gift to humanity. And this restores the world and brings life to civilization. Now, I particularly love the movies The Matrix, and I'm not sure if the Wachowski brothers did this on purpose or not, but in the Matrix movies, you will see all three levels of those final boons. In the first movie, Neo comes and has the sacred marriage with the goddess, Trinity, which, by the way, Trinity probably refers to the Tri-Devi. This is a reference, more than likely, to the Hindu goddesses, right? Because when Neo dies, it's then that Trinity says,
you can't be dead. You can't be. Because I love you. You hear me? I love you.
And thereby is Neo resurrected, right? So it's with his marriage with the anima. It's this new birth, right? And it's a spiritual birth, not a physical birth. Just like what Christ describes. He says, unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of heaven. You have to go into a death and a resurrection in order to come into the realization of this transcendent life. In the second movie, we see the hero journey touching on atonement with the father. This comes through in the image of the architect, and I really enjoy the scene because many of you might not know this, but in fact Keanu Reeves played in a movie portraying the Buddha, the little Buddha. And when he faces off with Yama, the Lord of Death, he refers to him as the architect.
You who go where no one else will dare. Will you be my god, architect? Finally I have met you. You will not rebuild your house again. But I am your house. And you live in me. O Lord of my own ego. You are pure illusion. You do not exist. The earth is my witness.
So I think that Keanu Reeves had a hand in doing this, where he was trying to communicate through both of these movies that essentially the message of the Matrix is in many ways and in many respects similar to the message of the Buddha. But in that scene, Neo comes into the room of the architect, and the architect explains to him that there is this much bigger mystery of which he is a part. And it's not just a simple matter of crushing the powers of darkness. He has to recognize that he plays an essential role in the cyclic existence of beings, all beings who occupy the Matrix. And if he does not restore the Matrix, everyone will die. This is an extraordinary dynamic wherein which the self archetype is expressed as this father figure, and the ego is then called to a higher level of realization. In the final movie, Matrix Revolutions, we see Neo merging with Smith. And in that merging, the ego and the shadow have come together as one, and it explodes in a power of creativity, right? And this is the direct result of something which took place earlier in the movie. So there's this whole apotheosis that takes place. Neo transcends himself. And even in those final images, we see Neo stretched out and he's surrounded by a cross of light, right? This expresses that the ego has sacrificed itself for the restoration of the world. This is apotheosis, the highest level of spiritual realization and enlightenment.
Wait. I've seen this. This is it. This is the end. Yes. You were laying right there, just like that. I stand here, right here, and I'm supposed to say something. I say, everything that has a beginning has an end, Neo. What did I just say? No, this isn't right. This can't be right. Get away from me! What are you afraid of? It's a trick! You were right, Smith. You're always right. It was inevitable. Is it over? it's not fair.
And I remember kind of coming out of the light and looking around, and once again there was this emptiness, this darkness that was all around me. And I felt as if, again, there was no depth. I couldn't tell. It was so dark that I couldn't even tell if it was deep. And I leaned forward, and as soon as I did that, this star appeared. It was this bright star, like Venus on the horizon, you know, just before the sun rises or sets. And it was the same kind of light that's here in this world. It was not that divine light. It was a worldly light.
Why is it so dark? In the beginning, it is always dark. What is that? One grain of sand. It is all that remains of my vast empire. Fantasia has totally disappeared? Yes. Then everything's been in vain. No, it hasn't. Fantasia can arise in you. From your dreams and wishes, Bastian. How? Open your hand. What are you going to wish for? I don't know. Then there will be no Fantasia anymore. How many wishes do I get? As many as you want. And the more wishes you make, the more magnificent Fantasia will become. Really? Try it. Then my first wish is... Backwards even more beautiful than I thought!
So the essential message here is that all great mythologies communicate these universal truths. They're truths which refer to the reality of the psyche. And I can assure you guys that I have confronted these things. These things become unbelievably real as soon as you step across that threshold into the world of dreams. And suddenly you look around and the content of your waking life starts reflecting the content of your dreams. And you feel as if you're being carried along by this invisible hand. And more often than not, in the great myths, in the really, really great myths, the self-archetype will never be seen. There are many levels to the hero's journey, and honestly, I feel like we could make this video 10 times longer, but really it's something that there's an enormous amount to learn about. And I really wanted to take you guys through this, to introduce you to this amazing adventure, which can take place in the contents of your own unconscious mind. And I want to let all of you know that you are the hero of your own life. And I would encourage each and every one of you to find a religious practice, to find a guru, to find a teacher, to go out and find that sage that will give you the methods you need to navigate the contents of the unconscious mind.
I know you're out there. I can feel you now. I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't know the future. I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin. I'm going to hang up this phone, and then I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see. I'm going to show them a world without you. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible. Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you.